Welcome to tonight's event, Rethinking Human Rights, Challenges and Opportunities in the 21st Century. I'm Terry Gordon, Director of the Gender Studies Program at the New School. I'm delighted to welcome the Women's Learning Partnership back to the New School. There could be no more urgent issue than human rights, and in particular human security, today. This week, on the heels of International Women's Day, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon signaled the, quote, alarmingly high levels, end quote, of violence against women and girls across the globe and called for a renewed commitment to women's human rights. Today, WLP has assembled an international panel of experts and activists in the field of human rights to address some of the most pressing issues today. The premiere of WLP's new documentary film on human rights in the 21st century will be followed by a panel discussion and a Q&A with the audience. It is an honor to introduce Mahnaz Afkhami, President and founder of WLP and former Minister of State for Women's Affairs in Iran. Mahnaz Afkhami has been a leading advocate of women's rights for over 3 decades. She founded the Association of Iranian University Women and served as Secretary General of the Women's Organization of Iran before the 1979 revolution. Her publications include Faith and Freedom, Women in Exile, Leading to Action, a Political Participation Handbook for Women, and Victories Over Violence, Ensuring Safety for Women and Girls. Many thanks to Jonathan Bach, Chair of Global Studies at the New School for Public Engagement, and Pamela Tillis, Director of Public Programs at the New School for Public Engagement, for their support of this program. Finally, I would like to thank my assistants in Gender Studies, Sam Morrison and Jane Maria Tahir, for their help with the event. And now, Mahnaz Afkhami.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you very much, Terry, not just for this evening and for the wonderful reception that you've put together and all the collaborative efforts, but also for the last 4 years. This is our 5th year here, and it's always a pleasure to work with New School. And the 2 programs tonight, the Gender Studies and Global Studies programs have been really very helpful, and we look forward to many, many collaborations in the future. And on behalf of WLP, I would like to welcome everyone here. I know how difficult it is to get around in this city, especially when there is a few drops of rain, and also at this time when cabs seem to be changing their times and causing a lot of confusion. So thank you for being here. You came on a very good evening. We're launching our human rights film called Human Rights, The Unfinished Journey. And it's a very good moment to be doing this, to be launching this particular film. For one thing, it's the 20th year after Beijing, and a lot of excitement is being generated in this city at the United Nations and among the NGOs. And also for us at Women's Learning Partnership, it's the 15th year of our work. We started our conversation and brainstorming in Beijing in 1995, and being very sort of deliberative, slow-moving, careful people, it took us 5 years before we actually originated Women's Learning Partnership in the year 2000. And what happened was that we saw 35,000 NGOs at Beijing doing all sorts of things, and we kept thinking, what's the missing thing? What's the added value? What's the essential, we thought, central focus? And we decided that basically what we need to do is to work on reshaping the architecture of human relationships, a very small, humble, narrow goal. And So we thought that this change in human relationships is basically has to happen at the individual level, at the nucleus of human relationships, which is the family, in the school, in community, in society, and internationally. And it has to be a reshaping of relationships from the top-down authoritarian patriarchal model to a horizontal, dialogical, participatory model that allows everyone's creativity to flourish and to expand and to show itself in dynamism. And so 20 organizations have been working together and creating curriculum that fits this type of work. We also had a belief at Beijing, and continue to hold that belief, that human rights are shared universally by everyone. Whenever we travel to our partner countries, to different villages, towns, grassroots gatherings, we always see, if you ask a group of women, no matter what level of sophistication, what would you like for your daughter, not even for themselves, because women usually don't want much for themselves, across the global south especially, but they always will list some set of ideas that end up to be almost identical to the Declaration of Human Rights. So that you never see anyone saying they don't want a right to freedom or to travel or to livelihood or any one of the rights that are enshrined in that document. But however, we need to be able to have people own these aspirations and actually contextualize them to their language, to their culture, and to their contextual environment. And that's what we've been doing, 20 languages, adapting curriculum to 20 different kinds of settings and circumstances. And it's been a very successful kind of an effort, because we have each of the partners has in themselves created another international national network, which includes the non-governmental organizations from their nation, gives national coverage, and some act as regional entities. So we have spread to 40 other countries, and so the outreach is very good. So that's the good news. And when we started, things were a lot better. In 2000, if you remember, was when we already had the Beijing platform. We were shortly to have the CEDAW Convention, which actually expanded and deepened the rights that we looked for in the Declaration of Human Rights. And there were all sorts of other resolutions which came and helped women to have a firm base from which to work. And if you remember, the heads of state gathered here in New York to make the Millennium Development Goals and set timetables for when we would get them. All of that was really quite energizing, and we really thought that we're going to go from basically aspiring to human rights to actually achieving human security for every human beings within a few decades. And then, of course, we had the horrendous attack on the United States in 9/11. And the wars that followed, including the war on terror, changed the whole landscape of human rights. And as before this event, we had come to a place where it would be, for instance, impossible to challenge some of the rights that we had worked with for so long, and or to ignore them. And even countries that didn't implement them or respect them in practice, at least verbally and in expressing their support, they were pretty adamant. But unfortunately, after those events, a lot of violence dislocation, war, death happened. And of course, security measures were increased and dominated the landscape. And people, fearing what they could not quite understand or predict, went along with all of that. So as a partnership, we get together often to go over what the world is like. And one of the things that we try to do more and more is, now that women are conscious of their rights almost across the world, now that many of them have found ways of actually participating at a leadership level at various institutions and political levels, we really need to bring our knowledge, our wisdom, our energies to actually confronting issues that are global, that are holistic, not only focusing on women. It's not as if we're going to, as a partnership, or that we recommend the rest of our sister organizations to take their focus off from the most abused half of the population or the most oppressed, but also that our wisdom needs to come to global issues, to what we face actually in the world today. So tonight, I'm very proud to be presenting to you the film, Human Rights, The Unfinished Journey. And it's not a positive film, I'm afraid, at least in the state of the world in which we find ourselves. But the positive message is that just as we did in 1948, after the horrendous war, World War II, that killed 60 million people, people came together and faced the situation of humanity and decided to work globally and change things, and achieved a declaration that spelled it out, what they wanted to do. I think perhaps, at least we all think, it's perhaps time to try to come together again and see what we can do collectively, men and women across the world, to rethink the way we're handling ourselves, the way we're doing business, and perhaps rekindle the effort to achieve full human rights for all human beings. I hope you like the film, and we all look forward to hearing from you if there's going to be a dialogue after the panel, and we will be very pleased to hear from all. Thank you very much.
A fire rips through a garment factory in Bangladesh, killing 112 workers. No emergency exits, no way to escape. A wife, frightened.
Please, help me.
Battered, nowhere to go. Children killed or kidnapped because they wanted to go to school.
I'm being kicked. We're being detained right now.
Citizen journalists detained under new terrorism laws. Others abducted and tortured for political dissent. Minority groups targeted because of their religion. Indigenous peoples stripped of their livelihood as multinational corporations plunder their environment. Women denied their rights to pass their nationality on to their husbands or children. Nearly 1 billion people worldwide with not enough to eat. Mothers forced to choose between feeding their children or keeping them warm. And from street children to veterans, no place to call home.
Human misery and human rights are very much interconnected. And unless we find ways of dealing with the underlying causes of those, we won't be able to bring about change. The right to health, the right to education, the right to economic well-being, all of these are part of what people want everywhere.
During World War II, 60 million people were killed. 15 million died in battle. The other 45 million were civilians. In the wake of these horrors, the world vowed never again.
We stand today at the threshold of a great event.
To make that hope a reality, the UN established the Commission on Human Rights in 1946. Under the leadership of Eleanor Roosevelt, a committee of 18 members from every corner of the globe participated, including China, Iran, Australia, the Soviet Union, France, Panama, India, and Uruguay. After 2 years of thoughtful debate, they created the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was then adopted by 56 countries.
And without any direct opposition, this Assembly has adopted this very important declaration.
This Universal Declaration of Human Rights may well become the international Magna Carta of all men everywhere.
The Preamble. Whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world.
Human rights to me means everyone being on equal footing and having what they need. Because we're all human, we're all the same species, so why don't we all have the same rights?
I think every right is equal.
All humans are equal, they have the same needs and the same right.
The right to vote, to assemble.
The right of expression.
Civil rights, political rights.
To love whom I want to love.
Choosing the person we want to spend our life with.
Women's rights.
The right to be able to work.
The right to clean air, right to water, right to education.
Food, water, shelter.
Food, clothing, shelter, and basic health care.
Peace. حقوق الإنسان حقه بركي بالحرية، حقه بأنه يعيش بكرامته، حقه بأنه يعيش بسلام.
The right to live free from fear.
They are something that we can't live without.
When the Universal Declaration for Human Rights was first written, it was really thought about as a holistic approach to what it means to be human. And so civil and political rights, the rights to free speech, the rights to not be tortured, were considered at the same level as economic, social, and cultural rights. And they were also considered indivisible. You couldn't have one without the other. So it's not just the rights that are indivisible, but our lives are indivisible. We don't have one aspect of our life that eats and the other one that can vote. We do both.
And yet the indivisibility of rights continues to be contested by those who don't believe that all humans deserve all human rights, either in the name of religion, cultural tradition, or simply the desire for power.
What we see throughout history in different countries, in different contexts, is that some are more human than others, and some are more entitled than others. And women have always been seen as less entitled than men, less human than.
I invite the Tehran Conference to seize the opportunity of a unique worldwide gathering to make a decisive contribution.
As the 20th century marched on, the UN continued its quest to bring governments together to address human rights issues.
Which is the foundation of human rights.
Historically, the West focused more on political rights, while the developing countries wanted more attention on social, economic, and cultural rights.
It is a forbidding task, un droit de l'espace.
At the first International Conference on Human Rights held in Tehran in 1968, they asserted their demands. The conference concluded with a proclamation reaffirming the commitment to the universality and indivisibility of all rights. And throughout the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, momentum was strong. Many important treaties and UN conventions were adopted.
The Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women,
the World Declaration on the Survival, Protection, and Development of Children.
At the same time, women were also organizing and demanding gender equality.
The message to the women of the world is, arise.
I would like to welcome you to this really historic event.
In 1975, the UN convened the first Global Women's Conference in Mexico City to craft a world plan of action.
It is the first intergovernmental meeting in the world.
The conference gave women the critical opportunity to begin building international coalitions. In the 2 decades that followed, subsequent conferences helped women to broaden their agenda and to raise awareness of women's rights issues. In 1993, at the UN Human Rights Conference in Vienna, women activists succeeded in getting violence against women formally recognized as a human rights abuse.
We began to talk about things like, at what point does domestic violence become torture? If a woman is confined to her home, if she's beaten regularly, if she has no access to leaving. These are all fundamental issues of torture and abuse. And it was really a turning point for the human rights community in recognizing that women's rights as human rights wasn't just a slogan, that it was about the life and death and abuse of women all over the world.
We are witnessing worldwide barbaric abuses against women. Now, some say this is all cultural. There is nothing we can do about it. I say it's criminal, and it's the responsibility of each and every one of us to stop it.
But just as women's rights were finally gaining international attention, the unthinkable happened.
Oh my God.
With nearly 3,000 people killed, a nation mourned, and a government responded. And the world we knew would never be the same.
Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated.
Terrorism became the dominant issue, and national security the top priority. Governments worldwide shifted to hard security measures and counterterrorism tactics.
Ordinary people voluntarily give up on some of their liberties because of the fear of what can happen. It's precisely the fear of terror that countries are able to impose measures that infringe on liberties and rights. It's as dangerous as counterterrorism.
The U.S. Congress passed the Patriot Act, giving law enforcement sweeping powers to bypass basic civil rights. Others quickly adopted similar legislation.
The pace of anti-terror operations has stepped up across Europe.
Of course, they were seen as necessary for security, but some of the legislation in the Middle East, North Africa especially, made a complete autocracy the norm.
Worldwide, regimes began using anti-terrorism laws to curb political dissent. Prior to 9/11, there were a few hundred arrests on charges of terrorism in the world. In the decade following 9/11, there were 120,000. 35,000 of them were convicted. Some for actual terrorist acts, but many more simply for carrying a political sign or blogging about a protest. The two countries with the most convictions, Turkey and China.
Tonight, what if the Constitution no longer applies?
Our federal government is keeping track of every phone call we make.
Extremely invasive spying programs that the public still does not know about.
The public needs to decide whether these programs and policies are right or wrong.
And in the West, lines became increasingly blurred between civil rights and state security. Drones were also introduced as a new weapon of war.
The idea that you can hunt somebody down through drones and kill them without charge or trial, sentence, or any kind of determination. This is an outrage.
Drone attacks have killed thousands. Some were terrorists, others innocent civilians.
The photographs were shot at the Abu Ghraib prison.
Many Americans will be disgusted by what they see.
Headlines around the world label the acts atrocities.
And the damage to U.S. interests in the rest of the world is hard to calculate, but it will be significant.
It moved us backward in terms of the assumption that some human rights issues were unquestionable. Because before that, there was a sense that human rights had a certain grounding, that there were some things that were undeniable, and we were pushing to make more things, like violence against women, undeniable. So on that level, it really shifted the government's willingness to trade off human rights for security.
It's a problem because many other governments around the world take their cues from the US. We've talked to government officials in many countries where we complain about unfair trials, we complain about torture, we complain about bad detention conditions, restrictions on civil liberties, and so on. And they basically say Guantanamo Bay, or they say Bagram, or they say Abu Ghraib, and that seemed to provide a justification.
According to the Amnesty International, many Kenyans actually would condone torture if it were for the public good.
In the Amnesty survey, 3 in 4 people in China and India said torture was sometimes needed.
A new poll reveals what to some is an uncomfortable truth.
Half of all Americans believe that torture is okay during interrogation.
There was a time when it would be impossible to articulate the possibility of a nation to uphold the use of torture or to consider it in terms of its effectiveness rather than in the sense of human rights. And this is an indication that our values have changed.
Since 9/11, the Middle East North Africa region has been embroiled in a non-stop series of conflicts. The reasons are complex and many. Infrastructure has been decimated. Sectarian violence has escalated sharply. Economies weakened, leaving a multitude of young people without jobs or purpose. The unresolved Palestinian crisis. Regime change and political oppression. A region awash with guns and weapons, now in the hands of Islamic jihadists that are seizing wealth and resources, including a new barbaric strain of violent extremists who target women and children. They not only promote rape, they profit from sex trafficking and forced marriages.
One says the price goes up if women have blue eyes.
These videos attract certain people, young people.
And through the effective use of social media, they are successfully recruiting the alienated and disenfranchised to join their jihadist scourge.
These people have no borders. The struggle against extremists, fundamentalists, this kind of terrorism is a global struggle.
Just look at what is happening in Syria. When the conflict first started, there was an opportunity to deal with the issue. It was a peaceful movement at the beginning. But states were not able to multilaterally come up with a common solution, and today you have a full-fledged civil war there.
And the human toll has been enormous. More than 2.5 million refugees fleeing violence have flooded Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. Nowhere to go, no money, no jobs. And families desperate for survival are compelled to sell their daughters for marriage to men who fly in from the Gulf. What the families hope for is a chance to give their daughters a better life. Sadly for many, it often doesn't work out that way.
حياة رعب أجد.
بياخدها شهر وشهرين بتمتع فيها ومتركها.
The worldwide cost of the war on terror is difficult to estimate, but in the United States alone, the estimate is well over $3 trillion. And counting. But the threat of terrorism is real.
For the people of France, it was 54 hours of anguish.
Multiple explosions in London.
Of course, the security side is important, but that is not the solution. No amount of security by itself will save us from terrorism. What we need is bring about change, real change. And a lot of it has to come through education, it has to come through empowering people, it has to come through alleviating poverty. It's not easy, of course it is not easy.
What we're asking for is an investment in human security, in the security and safety and dignity of people, not in more arms that are actually a threat to people.
Security, to me, the first thing I think of is knowing that I'm going to be able to find my next meal.
It means to have a balanced life.
Having the basic necessities.
I should have electricity 24/7 in my country.
To go to schools, not worrying about an explosion.
A job that can actually pay me a good salary.
The ability to move around and not be afraid.
That I have a roof over my head.
That peace of mind. Just feeling safe.
To be able to walk on the street without thinking that I might be getting chased.
Security is everything.
Since the whole world started this battle against terrorism and counterterrorism, they ignore totally that full respect for human rights is one very important tool to fight terrorism.
It's amazing what we're seeing here, because we never thought women will actually go out in Libya. It shows how much women want to speak out in this revolution.
The spark that ignited the Arab Spring was a cry for dignity. Women, side by side with men, from one country to the other, demanded an end to oppressive regimes.
All of these people have come out today to say we're not scared, we will not be silenced, and you will not keep us off the streets of our country until our country is totally free.
They wanted freedom.
I'm living in a free city and hopefully in the future a free country.
They wanted what all people want, their human rights.
We have proven that we can take this country forward.
But without a shared vision and the understanding of how to build a democratic society, they were outmaneuvered by religious fundamentalists who claim God is on their side.
There has never been an example around the globe of fundamentalist, extremist, conservative, Islamist, evangelical, you name them, in power, and people's human rights have thrived. We know very well that the first thing that religious fundamentalists do is curbing human rights, particularly curbing women's rights.
But the patriarchal structures and cultural norms that impede human rights are not easy to change.
People make culture, and people can change culture. But it does take contesting the values that are wrong, dialoguing and bringing about community to sit together and look at these issues, and then to say, how do we move together to bring about this change? It's a process, it takes a long time, but it has to be done if we want to ensure that human rights are really basics as part of everyday life.
It also takes understanding cultural context and providing education and training to understand what human rights are and how to advocate for them.
I think it's best for women to try to be organized. There is no dignity when you cannot put bread on the table for starving children, when you don't have medicines for a dying child. These are the kind of things that we need to understand, that women profoundly have the answers if we'll only listen as to how we make the changes in society. That's why training those women's groups is so important.
Women are becoming activated and engaged in a way that really has only developed in our time in the last 20, 30 years at a global level. And I think it is time for women to really think about how can we bring humanity back into a better relationship to itself, to its rights, to its community.
In the last 20 years, we've built an impressive architecture of human rights institutions. I think that we've got to actually light the fire in civil society, push to create the political space that allows us to make these rights real on the ground.
In the 20th century, it was acts of destruction and inhumanity that led the world on its quest to ensure universal human rights for all. In the 21st century, we have witnessed the erosion of those rights. Now, the challenge is to renew that quest and once again put forward the best of humanity.
We have to think about both the challenges that we're facing and not forget the opportunities. There's so many means of bringing knowledge to people, bringing a sense of oneness with the other, a sense of empathy. We just have to get our act together, work together, and when we see things which are wrong, to speak out. The answer is action.
We're not asleep. We see what's going on.
Solidarity and idealism. A way of making idealism a cool thing again.
So here I stand, one girl. I speak not for myself, but for those without voice can be heard.
Mugano. Mugano.
I am worth more. I know my rights and I'm willing to fight for them.
They thought that the bullet would silence us, but they failed.
Bunun için bir araya gelmek. Ama korkuyor muyum? Hayır.
I'm no longer afraid.
And out of that silence came thousands of voices.
Que nos están quitando todos nuestros derechos.
They're taking away all our rights.
We need to stop this issue now.
We have to finish.
And it is possible.
If we have hope, miracle will happen.
It's possible. We just have to believe that it is.
Some will say this is impractical, or too expensive, or too hard, or maybe even impossible. But it is time the world thinks bigger.
Good evening, everybody. It's very difficult to say anything after this film. However, with our wonderful panel of friends, we will listen to a commentary of a few minutes by each of our panelists, and then we're going to open the floor for a discussion with you for any questions and answers. We will begin to my left with Abina Bousia, who is a dear member of the Women Learning Partnership Board, as well as the chair of the Department of Women and Gender Studies at Rutgers University. Abina, do you have a few minutes? And I forgot to say, a great poet.
And yes, good evening, everybody. It is a privilege, actually, both to have been asked to join the board of the Women's Learning Partnership and to be here this evening. And having seen that film, I think I will actually begin with what I thought I would end with, and that is a poem. I'm the only person on the platform, I think, not in the film, but I think I represent two of the people who were, because it has also been my privilege this last 2 decades to be a member of the board of the Center for Women's Global Leadership at Rutgers, who's only here, thank you, yes. Founded by Charlotte Bunch, and the second director is Radhika Balakrishnan, both of whom were in the film, both of whom are doing other activities this evening. So I hope I do my sisters proud. There is so much in the film, and I think that Mahnad Afghami used a wonderful phrase in introducing it, and she spoke about the architecture of human relations. I think that's a very important word, because the concept of architecture involves both what is foundational as well as what is constructed on it. And architecture gives us, therefore, both the sense of, it gives us the platform on which things are built, but also invokes for us the changing spaces in which we live. And I think that's important about this film, The Unfinished Journey, because it is hard for us in any given moment to take the measure of how much has changed to get us to where we are. We take the United Nations for granted, and we forget the struggle it took to create that. I say I've been privileged to be at Rutgers because, again, I was there when the women at the Center for Women's Global Leadership became part of a network of people who went to Vienna. That has happened in my lifetime. So I want to share a poem which is called A Forward, a song in 7 stanzas for our granddaughters, which is a foreword I wrote. I wrote a poem in lieu of a preface for a collection of essays on women and resistance in Africa. It was specifically for a volume about African women's struggle for human rights. But those of us from the African continent are part of a huge network, and the issues we face of issues faced by all of us. There is might be a particularity in any given place, but that particularity is a local cultural manifestation of a similar issue that's manifested somewhere else in a different form. So, these are the issues. Tradition and the remembrance of things past are a rediscovered country of things we struggle against. Where as pygmy women we stand tall among the Bantu and name ourselves Babongo. We stand here, compassionate witnesses to witches who are just mothers, to mothers who are just loyal, to those who wrestle snakes to feed their children, and to grandmothers who keep faith enough with girls to make God change his mind. Young as we are, if we don't tell our stories, who will speak for us when we claim our bodies for ourselves and weep no more? When we write to each other and teach ourselves not to trade our bodies for security, wealth, power, or whatever price they can bring? When we call out and claim a love that knows no name and has no place? When we learn it's not rape if, and we still love our daddy as his bewildering passion penetrates us, shocking us to learn the forbidden pathways of ourselves and the things we struggle for. If we don't tell our stories, hailstones will continue to fall on our heads. thrown by fathers for the children to see, for we are not good women, thrown by imams by a judge's decree, for we are not good wives, thrown by other women in our husbands' lives as they come in the morning cradling his children, calling us witch, barren, bitch, and we find something to tie the chest with, challenging words to hurl back in battle, and partners to hold us anyway through the things we struggle against. If we don't tell our stories, who will know we did not comply? We did not wish our lives away, but stayed focused and staunched the cut of virginal blood to stop our daughters being slaves. We learned to sing survival songs through violence and rape and war. We did not tell each other lies or taste slow poison all alone. And stitched for our dead, not effigies, but new dolls, so our artistry displays that prayer heals despair through the things we struggle for. When we share strategy through story, we empower ourselves to take a stand and bear witness through our words in blood and ink, to wage peace as an act of faith, to call out by name the things we fear, not just victims or betrayed child soldiers, liberated from the fires of oil or greed or power. We claim a collective love, plant trees or wage a campaign, sing songs or keep silence as agents of a just resistance now and as in the past. Through bondage and through freedom, we share our tactics and document. We write from every different place to reclaim our names and inherited legacies we want to pass along. We write to stay in places as we choose, we who crossed the Atlantic all those yesterdays ago, we who have come again today. We who have stayed in place through generations, we who will stay in place tomorrow or move on between generations, between cultures, between locations, as we ourselves want now as in the future. We envision new futures for ourselves as we weep with each other in silence or laugh. We network behind shop counters and on factory floors. We engage across industrial landscapes and in mining villages. We reach out from fishing boats and commercial farms. We meet in schools, churches, parliaments, and slums. And from dance floors to prison cells, we are Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in the Liberian State House. We are the tomorrow our grandmothers dreamed. We are grandmothers dreaming other tomorrows, our own compassionate witnesses standing at the edge of time.
Thank you, Abena. That was wonderful. I'm going to turn to Rabia Nasseri from Morocco. Rabia is a founding member of the Association Démocratique des Femmes du Maroc, and Rabia was also a member of the National Human Rights Council in Morocco. Rabia will share with us in a few minutes her commentary on the film. She will on the film. No, please. She will speak in French, and I will be translating simultaneously.
Merci Lina, bonsoir. Voilà, je voulais juste dire que ce film nous montre que, disons, la continuité depuis 1948, donc lors de la... Je crois que nous, ici tous, nous appartenons à une génération qui n'a pas vécu la Deuxième Guerre mondiale. Et donc, on n'arrive pas à se rendre compte aussi des atrocités qui ont été commises. Et aujourd'hui, on se retrouve dans d'autres atrocités.
First of all, this film shows us really a continuity from 1948 until now. Most of us here have not lived through World War II, and maybe we do not realize the atrocities that had happened since, but we're facing these atrocities today.
Je vais me placer de la perspective du film, purement du film, de la perspective du système du dispositif international des droits de l'homme.
I'm going to talk from the perspectives of international human rights mechanisms.
Donc ce dispositif, je pense aujourd'hui, et je crois que c'est ça l'intérêt du film, il le montre, c'est un dispositif aujourd'hui qui est à l'épreuve, qui est défié.
One of the things that comes out from the film is that the international human rights mechanisms are now being challenged.
Les guerres, le terrorisme, la misère, la pauvreté, la montée des violences, tout ça font que ce système aujourd'hui est interpellé.
Different wars, terrorism, misery, poverty, violence, all of this seems to tell us that the system now is as she said before, being challenged.
Ce dispositif a été mis, on sait dans quelles conditions, donc à partir de la DDH, et bon, il s'est multiplié, il est devenu complexe. C'est un véritable monstre, le dispositif international des droits de l'homme actuellement. Il s'est complexifié, mais en même temps, nous nous rendons compte qu'en s'élargissant, il devient de plus en plus vulnérable.
The system, we know how it came about, in which conditions, but it slowly became a monster. It became so complex. By becoming bigger, it has also become more vulnerable.
Alors, prenons le principe de l'universalité des droits de l'homme.
So let's start by considering the principle of universality of rights.
Ce principe aujourd'hui est interpellé parce que, à plus d'un titre, la question du relativisme religieux et culturel, ce système est en train d'accepter petit à petit et d'intégrer ce qu'on appelle les différences ethniques, les différences religieuses, les différences culturelles, ce qui n'était pas le cas aux origines.
For instance, if we take the principle of universality of rights, this principle is being undermined by relativism, cultural, religious relativism, to the extent that little by little it is starting to accept these differences, ethnic differences, religious differences, communal differences.
Dernièrement, je pense il y a quelques mois, même pas, je crois il y a 2 ou 3 mois, les États arabes, et pas seulement États conservateurs, ont poussé, incité, et ils ont fini par avoir un gain de cause. Le Conseil des droits de l'homme a adopté une résolution sur les droits de la famille. Je ne sais pas ce que ça veut dire, alors que normalement, les droits de l'homme, c'est des droits individuels. Là, on a voté une résolution sur les droits de la famille.
So recently, for instance, just a couple of months ago, Arab states, those conservatives and those who are less conservatives, and other states as well, have actually succeeded in pushing for something called the rights of the family. What are the rights of the family? That is obscure because we know that human rights are individual rights.
Aussi, le système est interpellé par rapport au relativisme, par rapport aux droits des femmes. L'universalité des droits de l'homme a toujours été interpellée par rapport aux droits des femmes. On a toujours accepté que beaucoup d'États n'appliquent pas les normes et principes des droits de l'homme aux droits des femmes, et ça a toujours été accepté. La preuve, c'est les réserves, etc., etc.
And also, the principle of universality of rights has always been undermined when it came to women's rights, and an indication of this is the fact that we have accepted reservations on the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women because of these differences.
Je prends aussi un deuxième niveau qui est l'effectivité. Et là, c'est vraiment, on peut parler pendant des heures. Je prends juste un exemple, deux normes du système de droit international, qui est l'opposabilité, c'est-à-dire que c'est des droits qui doivent être justiciables, et d'un autre côté, la souveraineté des États. Donc ce sont 2 normes qui sont un peu contradictoires, c'est-à-dire que l'individu peut aller devant les justices pour certains droits, parce que les droits économiques et sociaux ne sont pas tellement justiciables, mais au moins les droits politiques et civils. Et donc il y a un dispositif de justiciabilité au niveau international, mais en même temps ce dispositif des droits de l'homme reconnaît et consacre la souveraineté des États, c'est-à-dire que personne n'a le droit donc de toucher à la souveraineté des États.
And also another level is the level of effectiveness. An example, a simple example here is that normally you do have access to international justice, but this access is really also undermined by state sovereignty, by the recognition of state sovereignty. So at the same time you have a paradox. You have the right to take a country to court, but nobody is going to oppose state sovereignty.
Je prends juste un exemple par rapport à ça. Il a fallu des années, je ne sais pas combien d'années, au mouvement féministe international pour que la Cour pénale, le statut de Rome, de la Cour pénale internationale, reconnaisse les violences sexuelles comme étant disons, des crimes contre l'humanité. C'est une reconnaissance, on était très contente. Mais l'application... on va voir.
Let's take another example, which is International Criminal Court, and it took years for the recognition of sexual violence as crimes against humanity. But again, how is this being implemented? We have yet to see.
C'est-à-dire les crimes sexuels, les violences sexuelles pendant la guerre. Donc c'était. Mais combien de personnes, alors qu'en Libye, en Syrie, dans tous les pays de conflit, même en Algérie, à partir des années 90, nous savons que beaucoup de groupes islamistes terroristes ont kidnappé des femmes, les ont violées, etc. Mais ces groupes n'ont jamais été traduits. Ils ont été graciés par le président, donc ils n'ont jamais été traduits en justice.
Let's take the examples of Libya, Syria, and also Algeria. And we know very well in Algeria, the Islamist group during the 10 years of terror, they have raped women. They were never held accountable for this. To the contrary, they were amnestied by the president.
Donc, je dirais juste 2 mots avant de terminer. Je dirais que le système des droits de l'homme a péché à l'origine. Il y avait un péché, disons, à l'origine. C'est un système qui réellement n'a jamais reconnu et pris réellement en compte le patriarcat.
So she wants to end with a couple of comments. The human rights system started with what she calls an original sin, which is not recognizing patriarchy.
Et donc, il a essayé de rattraper, grâce au travail qui a été fait par le mouvement féministe, de reconnaître la question en disant que les droits des femmes sont des droits de l'homme, etc. Donc, petit à petit. Mais réellement, au fond, c'est un système qui a regardé l'individu comme étant un être asexué.
Of course, they tried to compensate for this later on by saying that women's rights are human rights. But at the beginning, there was this major gap, which is considering human beings as an asexual being and not considering that it's governed by patriarchy.
Et je voudrais vous raconter une histoire pour vous montrer que dans nos pays où il y a maintenant le terrorisme, les conflits armés au nom de la religion, au nom de l'islam, dernièrement, il y avait une femme mariée marocaine qui a quitté son mari pour aller rejoindre les combattants de l'État islamique en Syrie.
So I'm going to tell you a story from our countries, from which, as you know, now are plagued by terrorism, conflicts, war, etc. Very recently in Morocco, a woman has left her husband to join the jihadists, the takfiris, the Islamic State in Syria.
D'habitude, quand un homme, des jeunes hommes vont, bon, les gens se disent, bon, comment ça se fait et tout ça, mais ils comprennent toujours. Mais là, il y a eu quand il s'agit d'une femme mariée qui est partie, elle a laissé son mari qui a porté plainte devant la justice. Il y a eu une levée de bouclier de l'opinion publique. Il dit comment elle a pu partir et laisser son mari. Donc, ce que je voulais dire, que le patriarcat est plus fort que l'islam. Voilà, après je voulais terminer.
So basically, when this woman left, her husband took her to court, and then people were upset. How could she leave her husband? How could she leave her husband? They were not condemning why she left her husband to go to Syria. as a comfort girl for the jihadists, but actually how could she leave her husband was basically. So this is just to say how patriarchy is rooted in our systems, in our societies.
Merci.
Thank you. I turn for some final comments from Yakin Ertürk, also a colleague and a member of the WLB Board of Trustees. As you know, Yakin was the former member of the Council of Europe. She was on the Committee for the Prevention of Torture, and she's the former United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. Yakin.
Thank you very much. And I'm also a proud board member of WLP. I'd like to start by congratulating the Women's Learning Partnership for this excellent movie, which I'm sure many of us will leave here with many thoughts. Even if you haven't thought of them now, I'm sure they're there. They're going to be haunting you. It's sort of it's a short movie, but it really captures the history of how human rights discourse has evolved in the last century and where we are today. And I think the comments that have been made are all very much linked to what the video, the messages that the video is conveying. Mike. So it's, I really congratulate WLP for this initiative and its president, my dear friend and colleague, Manaz, whom you have already heard. And I really take pride in that I am affiliated with WLP, and I'd like to thank them for giving me space in the movie as well. I'm not so proud that my flag has flown there, symbolizing oppressive measures. I would have liked to see it as a pioneer of human rights. And I'm sure a lot of you sitting in the audience, US citizens, probably felt the way I did. I'm from Turkey, and you saw my flag along with China. And also some scenes in the movie, I'm sure, made many of you in the audience uncomfortable. But a great American once said, "We shall overcome. We are going to overcome." And in order to do that, I think we really need to not abandon human rights, which seems to be the move today, but really claim it, because it is not human rights what is wrong, but how the structured inequalities in the world uses and misuses human rights that has made many skeptics and critics of the human rights discourse. Now, just reflecting on what has already been said, of course, my dear friend here has so eloquently spoken with given her messages with a poem, which I dare not even comment on because I'm a poor, I'm not very good in literary work, but it was great listening to her messages. There are a number of threats today, I think, and which the movie has very well portrayed, and also I think it came out from the interventions here. First of all, we have to say that the enthusiasm of the 1990s, which really brought us all to the streets, believing that we could create a different world, seems to have come down, especially the leaders, the officials, are not so enthusiastic anymore about human rights. But there are a number of issues that we need to take into consideration as to why this momentum has somewhat slowed or even died in some cases. The movie very much, the video very much openly showed that there are competing paradigms which seems to suppress human rights. And one of the main paradigms of our time is the security paradigm, of course. And that was very much the message around which the video dwelled on. The security paradigm, national security, public safety, these concerns are not only suppressing human rights in the global south. But unfortunately, even in the countries where human rights values were promoted initially, perhaps, under the guise of counterterrorism and public safety, many of their own values are being violated in the centers of Western European countries. So security is something we need to look at and insist on redefining security as not something to suppress people through use of politics of fear, but to ensure human security and balance these issues. There's also a shift in global power relationships and political discourse towards a right-wing politics. Now, when we say right-wing politics, you may all think of some of the horrible scenes we saw there of the extremist movements. But please let us not overlook the right-wing encroachments on our lives, which come in moderate and very discrete forms. I see right-wing politics as a continuum from a very liberal environment to all the way towards extremists. So there is a promotion of right-wing concerns which infringe on civil liberties, and particularly rights of women. The abortion issue is a hot one in all parts of the world. In my own country, where we have, since the 1980s, had adopted a very solid abortion law, has all of a sudden come to the agenda, and our current president, who was the prime minister not too long ago, declared that abortion is murder. These are very worrying signs. Turkey may not reflect the typical extremist Muslim or Islamic country, but where does moderation and where does extremism end and start? I think we need to be critically aware of this. The global business practices, I think, are another area that have really infringed on human rights, and sweatshops still continue, and many of these practices where corporate violation of human rights is almost done with impunity. Again, this is another competing area with human rights. So we could go on and count many issues where today have become more prominent in terms of state agenda, which puts human rights to the sideline. But why are states and those in power so reluctant about human rights? What is wrong about human rights? Everybody we heard said that we are human beings and we should have human rights. Well, human rights is a cultural protest. It's a means of rearranging the terms of engagement. So it means changing power relationships. It means resisting state oppression. It means resisting patriarchal oppression. So this is why it's so difficult to promote human rights. But at the same time, what choice do we have as ordinary citizens? We can either resort to passivity, we can resist in our own individual ways, or we can join forces and strive for transformative change. And I think this is where the human rights discourse provides us with a solid ground. So what gives human rights legitimacy is not the state discourses, is not the fact that human rights discourse is based on documents, treaties, resolutions, based on consensus, which is no doubt very important. But what is the real driving force and legitimacy of human rights is the civil demand and transnational movements. Now, this is easy to say, but we also see that these movements are also being appropriated. Terms of human rights, democracy, etc., are being appropriated by repressive regimes and repressive movements. So these are all challenges. How do we weed out these? Is every voice on the street a pro-human rights voice? Who holds who holds the right to determine whether it is or not? These are not easy questions, and I think the Arab Spring gave us a lot of fruit for thinking in this regard. So I think I shall stop here, and I presented more questions really than answers, but just to end with a point that Rabia made reference to, and that is that human rights, in fact, was very patriarchal, and we saw this in the video where Eleanor Roosevelt presenting the Universal Declaration and referring to all men are equal. Now, those days, that was a very normal terminology, but I think today we have changed the language. And this change is not just a matter of words, but it's a change that reflects the transnational movements which women have joined forces in. So what I'm trying to say is that human rights is not a static, finished business. It's an unfinished journey, and it will not finish as long as we have oppression, exploitation, and inequality, etc. Human rights is a dynamic force which takes shape according to the struggles that underlie it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank the panelists for their thought-provoking and thoughtful remarks, as well as WLP for the very incisive film. So I'd actually I want to open up the questions to the audience, and I'll just begin with a question of my own with a literary flavor, because my field is comparative literature. So the film traces out a kind of master narrative of a war on terror, a narrative which has enabled violence and the suppression of political dissent and civil rights. I was struck by a line in Abina Busia's poem, "If we don't tell our stories," and later to call out by name the things we fear. So my question is, to what extent might storytelling or narrative disrupt this master narrative and enable both a recognition of local lived realities and alternative possibilities?
You want them to answer?
This is for the group, for the panelists.
Anybody likes to
question about storytelling and narrative?
Yes, well, I think that is the wonderful power of stories. They do disrupt. However, and you know, one of the first lessons you learn if you study history is that imperialists kill the poets before they kill the politicians. There is a reason why. If you're an imperialist, it's the thing to do, you know, because it's a question of the power of language and the question of the power of vision. However, one of the major issues in doing human rights work is that very often it can be difficult to know what story is actually going to move or change things. I want everybody to look up and look around the wonderful auditorium that we're in, okay? I've been here several times. You know it, we walk into similar kinds of structures. It's circular, it's domed, and it works. None of us really, ordinary lay people, walk into this room and think, I wonder what keeps the roof up. Is it going to collapse? How does it stay circular? We don't. We take it for granted. We sit in it. It's comfortable. It's beautifully designed. Only somebody who knows the history of architecture and knows what it is to build is going to walk in here and say, I know, I can figure out where the support structures are. To change our societies, we need to know where the support structures are in order to dismantle them, and to dismantle them without the roof falling down on our heads. And that is our problem. Figuring out the support structures. And very often, unfortunately, the way human beings really dismantle support structures is to say, it doesn't matter a damn if the roof falls down on our heads. That's what revolutions do. But unfortunately, the film starts off with pointing out who gets killed when the roof falls down. But keeping those two things in tension is very, very hard. Dismantling something slowly so that we all live is what coalition building and network does. But it can be painfully slow, and meanwhile people are dying and getting desperate. And so you think, well, maybe the roof had better come down on everybody's head, and those few people who survive will have a chance to start again. It's a very difficult calculation, and only when we tell ourselves stories that we can listen to with care can we figure out what are those structures that we need to dismantle. But most of the time, we're not seeing them, and we're not talking about them, and we don't recognize that the walls might be closing in on us.
Thank you. We'll open the floor up for questions from the audience. If you could approach either of the mics here for any questions for the panelists.
Thank you so much for the panel and the film. I think it really, for me, encapsulated the moment that we're in and the kind of questions that we need to ask ourselves. I want to ask about an issue that's increasingly troubling for me, apart from everything that's going on, and that is in terms of the response, even from what we would consider more liberal actors to the rise of religious fundamentalisms. And it is an assumption that the only way, or the most effective way, to challenge this is within a progressive religious context and interpretations. And for me, it completely lacks a power analysis in terms of what's going on. The counter progressive or feminist discourses can actually prove an effective challenge to this. It gives power and legitimacy and credibility to religious leaders, more so than every one of us. This is, as was mentioned, a human rights violation, an issue of crimes against humanity, of torture, and this is something that should concern all of us, not only calling out certain religious leaders as the solution. You know, I want to question also why the images of someone in a headscarf is somehow considered now more legitimate and credible and given as a depiction of diversity. I mean, are we doing the same thing in terms of a woman with a cross around her neck now? I'm from Canada. When I come to the airport of Canada, there are signs with people holding welcome in different languages, and one of them is a girl in a headscarf. For me, this is a symbol of a certain kind of interpretation, a conservative interpretation of Shiaism, and that's fine if they want to believe in that, but for me, that does not belong in a secular space. And talking about secularity, what happened to secularity? Of course, secularity without human rights can be as violent as religious fundamentalisms, but for me, as was mentioned, I have never seen a theocracy that was for women's rights. It is a precondition to women's rights. I think just to say that at the CSW, even in talking to funders, in talking to development agencies, they haven't recognized that actually legitimizing the only approach as being effective in terms of allying with progressive religious leaders, they don't understand what is wrong with that. And I think it is incumbent on us to provide that kind of feminist analysis and shift it from what is now being seen as just counterterrorism and the security analysis, the peace and security analysis, which doesn't recognize violence on women's bodies or people's bodies as an issue, which doesn't recognize the sanction and the policing of people's desires as violence, or not the right of dying for unsafe abortions or being left with harmful impacts for the rest of your life as violence. And it's only violence that's enacted at the political sphere that concerns them. So how do we change this? How do we recognize that this isn't something that's to do with something arising indigenously in communities, that it is a function of power, it's a function of funding, it's a function of military flows, it's a function of the crisis the world is facing right now in terms of economic disparities, environmental degradation, and why can we not bring that power analysis more in front? Thank you. The question was, how do we bring the discourses, but she said there was no question. My question is, how do we shift this lens that I see predominantly at the CSW, which is where a lot of us are now participating? The lens is a peace and security lens. It's not a power analysis from a feminist perspective that would take into account all the things that I said.
Do you want, Nina? Do you want us to answer? You want us to answer?
Oh, yeah, anyone could answer, or you could all answer separately. Or take different aspects of the question.
Maybe I can start, and you can, others can come in. I think that's a very well put question, and it's something I don't have a ready answer for at the moment. But definitely, some things have gone wrong along the way. The whole headscarf issue has emerged as a very political issue. I know in my own country, we were caught by surprise. We thought here we are an established secular society. Secularism meant this is how you dress, this is how you behave, etc., etc. So it was a very coercive understanding of secularism. And the opposite discourse came very surprisingly in a very forceful manner, where there were no ready answers. And I think we adopted, we meaning everybody, and this is global as well, not only in Turkey, we became very apologetic. And our apology made us somewhat wishy-washy. We lost our focus. Difference does not necessarily mean that we give up on a public discourse which promotes the rights of everybody. And that's where I think secular understandings need to be redefined, perhaps make it more responsive to the diversity without being encapsulated by it. And this is a problem that we need to really put in front of ourselves and see, because right now what is happening is that an opposite form of coercive discourse is taking place. Again, I'll give my example from Turkey. Turkey was seen as the country where moderate Islam would be promoted. But what is happening now is that a moderate the regime is sort of moving towards a moderate Sharia in a way. Slowly, slowly, what we saw as secular democratic institutions are eroding. And they're eroding by really confining our own space, not necessarily opening up space for those who were victimized by the coercive applications before. So, it's a very dialectical process. Now we need to go back and reassess all this and give up on the apologetic resignation to the situation and really define diversity within a rule of law and within respect for diversity for what it is, and not imposing one form of coercion over another. But I know this is not a very conclusive response to your question, but I really feel this is where we're at, and we need to ask this question and discuss it more and more.
I'm going to speak a little bit. Thank you, Shireen. Where are you? I'm going to speak a little bit about the first point, the first question that was raised, which is about working within the framework of religion. And I totally agree with Shireen. This is indeed empowering religion. I want to start by just telling you a fairly new story. It's like 2 days old. We have been, as a partnership, involved in a regional campaign on changing nationality laws in the region. And at one point, very early on in the process, the campaign received funding from a UN agency very early on in the process. And they have been writing a case study about it because it was very successful. And then they said in the case study that one of the elements of success was working with moderate religious leaders. This has never happened. In the 12 years of existence of the campaign, never, ever was there any strategy involving dialoguing, negotiating with religious leaders. And we've been having a fight during the last week with the agency in question. And their point is, it's good to be talking with religious leaders. Why won't you talk with religious leaders? Of course, it's about distorting history. But why am I saying this? It's because this, at least in my own experience, this issue of moderate religious leaders, development facilitated by religious leaders, how are you going to engage religious leaders? I'm sorry to say, but many of our donor communities are promoting this, and promoting this very, very strongly. I'm not sure, I want to talk about why they are promoting it, but they are promoting it. Funding faith-based organizations, actually creating a category called moderate religious leaders is an oxymoron. Where do religious leaders stand on abortion? Where do they stand on sexual rights? Where do they stand on equality in inheritance? And of course, we know whether moderate or less moderate, we know where they stand on these issues. Where do they stand on the universality of rights? Where do they stand on indivisibility of rights? Where do they stand on equality for all? With all of this in mind, and we know the answers to these questions, we wonder why is it that there is this continuous push to work through this nebulous category called moderate religiously. Look at the CSW now at the panels, how many panels are about religious leaders talking about violence against women and all the wonderful achievements that have been made via the religious framework, which we know is science fiction. We really need to know where is this coming from, whose interest are we serving by promoting some sort of successes and achievements by what I would call a non-existent category called moderate. Thank you. Rabia.
Oui, j'ai trouvé la question, ça j'ai bien compris, très intéressante. Effectivement, essayer d'avancer, de promouvoir le droit des femmes de l'intérieur, disons de la doctrine religieuse, effectivement, c'est une approche qui a énormément de limites parce que elle consiste, par exemple, si on prend comme exemple ce qui est appelé ici en Occident le féminisme islamique.
Okay, if I understood the question right, I think this is a very interesting question. This approach of promoting women's rights within the framework of religion has a lot of limitations. For instance, if we take the ideology of what is called here in the West of Islamist feminists,
c'est-à-dire les approches du féminisme islamique consistent à penser qu'il suffit de réinterpréter le Coran et la doctrine pour régler le problème.
And the assumption of Islamist feminism is that all it takes is reinterpreting the doctrine, reinterpreting the Quran, and then all the problems will be resolved.
Or, cette approche est dangereuse, enfin, elle n'est pas pertinente pour deux raisons. La première, c'est qu'elle tend à faire penser que les musulmans et les musulmanes, que les pratiques des musulmans et des musulmanes ne sont que fonction de la religion. Or, nous savons que les gens ont des pratiques et des comportements en fonction de leur classe sociale, en fonction de leurs intérêts économiques, sociaux, etc. C'est-à-dire que les gens ne réagissent pas, ils ne vivent pas tous les jours juste en fonction de leur
Now, this approach is basically problematic at two levels. One is that it assumes that all Muslims everywhere only live within the framework, everything in their lives is decided by religions. And Muslims, women and men everywhere, have other considerations. and other interests, be it economic, social, financial, different social classes.
Le deuxième est que leur approche tend à ethniciser l'islam et les musulmans, c'est-à-dire à nous figer dans une identité, à nous renvoyer dans une identité qui est définitive et qui n'est pas évolutive.
My dear friend Mahnaz will forgive me for using a word, but the second problem is that this approach basically tends to essentialize Islam, make it fixed in time, in space. And actually, sorry, not essentialize Islam, but essentialize Muslims, so that they are a fixed, homogeneous entity that does not change with time, with space, with different contextual conditions.
Et pour terminer, je voudrais juste dire que, et puis elle a tendance à oublier que le patriarcat a trois bases, trois piliers. Le premier, c'est un pilier économique, c'est la division sexuelle du travail. Travail à l'intérieur, à l'extérieur du foyer. C'est ça qui est fondamental en réalité. La deuxième, c'est une base sociale, disons les relations sociales. Et la troisième, c'est la base symbolique. Je veux dire, c'est la culture, c'est la religion qui permet de légitimer donc l'inégalité et le patriarcat.
And actually, this approach basically forgets or tends to oversee the fact that patriarchy has three essential pillars. The first pillar is the economy and the gender division of labor, who does what, where. The second pillar is a social pillar, so the social relations between people. And the third is actually the symbolic part, which is culture and religion, that is actually legitimizes the two other pillars.
Merci.
I'm actually glad that Rabia ended with the symbolic, because that's what I was trying to get at when I talk about what holds the building up. And it is as dangerous for the work we are trying to do to become fixed in our interpretations of the symbolic on one side, as we are accusing the people whose patriarchal notions we have to challenge of fixity on their side. To make a statement like a photograph of a woman, Muslim, an Islamic woman in a veil at the entrance to a girl in a veil, as part of the images of welcome when you enter a state. To make a statement, this does not belong in a secular state. Although we understood what you were getting at, it raises the question then of what is the place of somebody of faith in a secular state. We cannot confuse, and I know the personal is political. Nevertheless, we have to be careful about how we read the symbolic and confusing the legal frameworks with the social space we try to create. If we are insisting that everyone has rights, then the person who wants to be a nun has the right to wear a habit and a cross. And a young girl, well, you're saying as an adult.
No, but can I just
yeah.
say something on that? The fact that the state of Canada has given in to that discourse of diversity being equal to a certain interpretation of Islam and Sharia is problematic for me.
I understand what you're saying.
Contextualize in terms of the rise of the conservative Muslim community, the power of that community in Canada.
I understand what you're saying. Okay, so I'm not denying what you're saying. And all of us have seen that steady, slow, what's the word, incremental constriction. And it is done through the symbolic. I'm not denying that. What I'm saying is that we also need to be cautious, otherwise we fall into the trap that is being set for us. In this country, in the United States, for example, I became very, I don't know, the use of the word family gives me goosebumps because of what has happened in a political sense to the phrase family values, for example. Because it's a very clever phrase, because most of us, even those people from dysfunctional families, want to claim a family. If your family is dysfunctional, you call it dysfunctional and you're looking for another one, because nobody wants to turn around and say a family is a bad thing. And at least I have yet to meet somebody who wants really, that is to say there's an emotive force to the term, to the use of the word family, which makes the claiming by the right of the term family values so dangerous, because then it becomes difficult to fight them without you looking crazy. And that's what I mean, that we need to be careful about even the use of language and disaggregate, and it's hard to use the word purify, but all I'm trying to say is that we can get pushed against a wall and become and react for reasons we consider right in terms of correct, and end up being as rigid and blind as the people whose actions and ideas we're trying to dismantle. And that's what makes the work difficult. And I think that's also what makes humanities, that's what makes an attention to the meaning of visuals, the meaning of words so very, very important. You know, Asya Jabbar of blessed memory can hardly be accused of being a reactionary, Islamic fundamentalist. But it was her story about being able to wear a veil and therefore see differently and challenge that made me hypersensitive to the ways in which symbols can our alertness about what symbols can mean in different contexts. That's all I'm saying. And it's difficult work. And we have to be sensitive to our own reactions as well as the reactions of the people we are challenging.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Please come to the mic.
Thank the New School for hosting this, and thank the Women's Learning Partnerships and the Center for Global Women, the Rutgers people, Charlotte Bunch and company, for all your work for all these years. My name is Myra Koveri. I'm with the International Network of Women with Disabilities. I'm also attending CSW 59, Beijing Plus 20 review this year, and had the pleasure of marching with over 3,000 women from Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza to Times Square on Sunday for International Women's Day. UN Women, Beijing Plus 20, CSW 59 was out in force. So that's a little bit of good news. I also appreciate the what you just said about symbol. And I wear many hats. I am the facilitator and one of the moderators of the International Network of Women with Disabilities. I'm also a classical harpist, and a good one, and have played in the General Assembly Hall for the entry into force of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I'm also have a master's in landscape architecture from Cornell University, and appreciate your comments about art and architecture and symbol and words. And please don't shoot the piano player over here. I switched from playing the piano to playing the harp, so nobody minds when the harpist acts crazy. So that's my Thank you for the introduction. I am considered crazy. I'm considered seriously and persistently mentally ill. That is the disability that I that brought me to becoming an activist on behalf of women with disabilities. And I've been doing that since 1977. And so a little bit more good news, I would like to say that not only did we have Vienna in '93, but we had Cairo in '94 with the International Conference on Population and Development, where they declared women's rights were human rights as well. We had Beijing, 1995, its 20th review, and I had the pleasure of being in Noordwijk, Netherlands, in 2014, sorry, 2013 for the ICPD Beyond 2014 conference, representing the International Network of Women with Disabilities. And in the meantime, we have the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So in honor of Eleanor Roosevelt and Simone de Beauvoir and Kate Millett and the four mothers who have gone before us, I'm very pleased to be here as an insane woman and very crazy and a determined activist. I'm composing, I'm setting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to music, and my question to you all is, how do you propose to include women with disabilities, of all disabilities, including mental disabilities? And I would like, before I finish the question, I want to say also that in my opinion, the new religion is psychiatry. That's the enemy. It's Nazi propaganda. Mental illness is Nazi propaganda. It was dreamed up in the 1920s and 1930s, started in the US, exported to Nazi Germany. The US government is totally corrupt and involved in all this. And how do you plan to include women with disabilities? Just because we are amazing. We have learned the difference between enabling in a positive sense and enabling in a sense of supporting addictions. We know the difference. We need your support. We offer you our support. How can we help, and how will you include us? Thank you.
Somebody would like to answer? Would you like to
I don't know why I've been designated to deal with this question. But first of all, in terms of your craziness and being a harpist, I would refer you to one of the great singers, composers of the 20th century, the late Abbey Lincoln. When the party's over and all the guests have gone, you got to pay the band that played your song. Okay, so but seriously, I think that the question of women with disabilities, I'm sad that you think that you are being ignored, because in all the organizations I work with, women with disabilities have a voice. Now, there's a difference between are you heard and are you part of the conversation, and have the changes been made? And women with disabilities, in some sense, are a wonderful symbolic challenge to all the things that we're talking about. Physical disabilities are a challenge to the physicality of the space. You know, you build a building with steps and you forget to put the ramps, etc. That, in a sense, is visibly easy, sometimes costly to change. I think the tougher one is what to do with the disabilities that are not visible. And in that sense, I really think that so-called primitive societies were much, much smarter than late industrial capitalist societies, because there was always a place for people who think differently. Sometimes we were called fools, but even fools had a place in the king's court. That is to say, the rigidity of what constitutes normal has not always been there in Western societies, and B, is not there in other societies, the rigidity. The question is how to keep hold of societies that are not afraid of fluid boundaries. And that is a challenge in societies which are dependent on fixity and boundaries and being able to label. Going back to what I said before, that's why you have to get rid of poets and musicians and people who insist on fluidities and being able to speak a sentence and it meaning 3 different things at the same time. There is no, that's dangerous.
And they put us in mental hospitals
yeah.
and shoot us up with Haldol and Benadryl and Ativan and put us in restraints. Yeah. And I've been there
What do you expect us to do?
3 months ago for me. Yeah. So thank you for being here and letting me speak.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Come up. Oh, we'll go take you and then we'll take you, okay? We'll start with you, yes.
Just a quick question. This is probably for Lena. In terms of what I heard you say about the whole issue of moderates, et cetera, it really came up to me. I started thinking more than what your comments were about there isn't such a thing as a moderate Islamic or any other religion, person who we could talk to in this process of sort of defying extremism, which you've been involved with us at the Institute for Peace and Justice. But we just came back from Sulu Archipelago, and I was invited to meet a young woman. This comment reminded me. And she was the person who started on Facebook, got involved in social issues, the right to wear the hijab down there in Zamboanga, which is a very difficult area. A lot of conflict going on between the Christian settlers and the traditional Muslims. And for her, that issue was nothing, actually didn't have that much to do with religion at all. It had to do with her right to speak up against the society that was oppressing her. And so to interpret her, if somebody met her or saw her immediately, I think you might be mistaken on what her intent was. I mean, her intent was to create a little space and for the first time in her life, say something on her own. And she just used the religious dimension of it to do that. But then I got thinking about your comments about dealing with moderate Islamic, or anyone, I mean, it doesn't make any difference, but it happened down there where we were dealing with this moderate and extremists. I mean, most of the people were carrying guns and, had been involved in military or militia groups, etc. But the point was, after we created that space, and maybe because I'm a psychologist by training originally, you can't change anybody. You can only create the space where they can change. And so if you can find a way, I used to call them benevolent tricks, but if you can find a way to create the space where somebody can change by themselves and see the greater vision, without the props of whether it's religion or any other, whether it's the political situation, it might be easier. And to throw those people out, I mean, there were some really amazing guys down there, and they were all men that we were working with, who began to see the light and who actually put on their Facebook pages, believe it or not, well, they call me a terrorist, but I'm a lovable terrorist now after having this conversation. So I just think, again, we can't ignore them or leave them out of the process, because I think that we have to create that space where they can see some other alternative. That's all. Yeah?
Very quickly. I want to respond from the point of view of where I stand, where the major process of emancipation of women has been in the early 1990s, and it was about removing the veil. Because the veil was, in whichever form it was a form of referring to women as sexual beings. I mean, I don't want to tell the story again, but that was a major historical landmark for agency, liberation, emancipation, etc. And that is why many of us now in 2015 find it incredibly challenging to think about the veil as an empowering, as something empowering. having said this, again, we cannot reduce the discussion about the veil to just whether it is, because we have to take into consideration what happens in the West and the way, and why has the veil become a symbol of quote-unquote resistance, the failure of inclusion, the failure, the racism, etc., etc. I mean, all of these are factors. But these are factors in the West. These are factors that are the failure of Western societies to actually accept new communities, to actually welcome new communities. When the thing started in France, something like 10, 12 years ago, when we were asked about the veil, we would say that it's a debate that is, I don't know how to translate it, franco-français, which is just for the French. It's an issue that you are facing because it's about you. It's not about the realities of women in this region. The journey of the veil has been very different, seen very differently in the West and in the global South. But again, I'm saying it's very difficult I'm talking personally, for me to see the veil as empowering. Particularly now, when you have ISIS, when you have the Islamic State, when the first thing that they are doing is actually imposing, is actually constraining women's, what women wear, how do they walk, where can they be, where can they not be, etc. And so that's why I can't discuss it as a choice, because we have to again deconstruct what choice means. What does it mean? What does choice mean in certain conditions, etc. But again, I think we really, all of us need to remember the major revolution in the early 1990s in Egypt, in Syria, in Palestine, when actually removing the veil was a symbol of freedom. It cannot, so 100 years later, it cannot be a symbol of, it cannot become all of a sudden a symbol of liberation.
Hello, my name is Jasmine Surya. I'm a representative of the Center for Inquiry. It's a secular advocacy group based in DC and in New York. So I have 5 sort of contentious points that I feel like I want to challenge the movie and what has been said today on. The first, I feel like has already been spoken about, this us versus them mentality of, okay, the problem is the fundamentalists, we'll put them aside and now we're all good. But I feel like that's already been spoken about, so that's one that I wanted to point out. But the assumption in the documentary that we just saw was that everyone wants rights, and it's just a matter of granting them, and that's a ubiquitous thing. Maybe I've interpreted it wrong. But we all know that the notion of freedom and the notion of equality are relatively new notions. And being somebody who grew up in Saudi Arabia, I came to the United States when I was 18. So there's this idea that everyone wants rights, or that women want rights, and they're in chains by the men, but that's not my personal experience. In fact, the most oppressive expressions to women have come from women to women, meaning, you can't do this, you're a woman, or, there's very literal interpretations of scripture. And so I feel like this notion has been neglected a little bit. But on a related note, when these freedoms are granted, freedom of expression, etc. It seems simple when we say, yes, everybody should have the right to freedom of expression, but it gets complicated when we get to where does that freedom end, meaning, the right to swing your fist ends at another man's face, etc. So there's been a lot of people that have said, yes, we support freedom of expression, but not like how it is in France, not like Charlie Hebdo, not in these specific contexts. And so it's really hard to find people who support freedoms once they get specific about the freedoms themselves. And finally, I find I feel like at the United Nations and at this conference, it's been touted over and over that education is the solution to these problems that are present in societies. And so I don't quite understand this notion, because coming from somewhat of a privileged background in Saudi Arabia, my mother was a doctor, she still simultaneously believed in things like, you know, the evil eye and witchcraft, even though she's carries a PhD. And so I feel like education doesn't seem to me to eradicate dogmatism and sort of this thinking that we're trying to challenge. So those are my few points. I hope you can address some of them. Thank you.
What kind of education always matters? We use the term very often simplistically, meaning schooling. Very often Western-style schooling. You can have a degree and not actually be educated. The question is, what is the purpose of whatever that educational process is? And you can get an amazing education listening to people's stories. And sometimes, so the question is, and again I keep saying this is what makes it difficult. Do you actually want to change the world? Because it's very, very easy. In fact, very often the purpose of educational establishments and institutions is to inculcate you into making sure you do not end up wanting to change the world. Which is why in places like the United States, those pockets of resistance that you can find, particularly in things like the interdisciplinary departments like women's studies, ethnic studies, cultural studies, Afro-American studies, and so on, have difficulty surviving. Those bodies that try to work within institutions whose original ethic was a challenge to the institutions of the place they are, have difficulty surviving. That's one. So never assume that because you're highly educated, other things have changed. All of us, certainly almost all of us from the global south, not only know people who live with these contradictions, we are people who live with these contradictions. Let's get real. You know, I'm probably your mother's generation, so maybe people under 30 have changed, but certainly those of us over 60 live with these contradictions on a daily basis. And sometimes that's positive, sometimes that's negative. And we each live our lives with the best integrity that we can. It is not surprising that in a lot of instances, it is women who oppress other women. It goes back to the issue that was raised earlier about a power framework and what I was saying about the invisible structures. Look, on one level, if I live in a society where the only way my daughter is going to get a good husband who will take care of her and give her status in society is if she is cut, then what am I condemning my daughter to if I tell her, you don't want to be cut? I mean, you know, I'm not justifying, but I'm saying there are always complexities. I remember that moment in Warrior Marks, a film about which I have a lot of criticisms, but a film whose impetus I understand. I remember that moment when one of the women who had managed to escape being circumcised and got to the West and was living in peace and freedom, had to deal with the fact that her act of running away had condemned her mother to being cast out. How many of us, if we know beforehand that if I do this, the person who's going to bear the brunt of my action is my mother, who I love dearly, are going to take that action? So none of these things are simple. And a lot of women do things which we articulate as oppressive because they consider it the best option in their capabilities, which is why collective action is always so important and is always much more effective than solo action. And my collective conversation is always much more powerful than thinking you need to take it on yourself. You know,
Just ask Yakin also to take a minute.
I totally agree with what has been said, particularly about education. I mean, there has been, the whole institution of education has been subject of criticism for long. And when I was a college student, we used to read Paulo Freire, who used to write about education for critical thinking and pedagogy of the oppressed, which seems to have slided down. But I think there's a lot of wisdom in what Paulo Freire and people like him were talking about. So being learned and being educated may not necessarily be the same thing. And we certainly learn a lot of things in school, but the wisdom that someone may attain through life itself can be far more valuable. So, you know, those are not very easy dichotomies that we can take for granted. So I definitely need, we should be careful of what modern education actually gives us and does not give us. But with respect to how the film struck you about, you know, everybody wants freedom, so the issue is to grant it. Of course, it's not that simple, because everybody wants freedom, but what does that mean to everybody is something else. And I think that was one of the points that I was trying to say. Yes, everybody does want freedom, but how does that translate into defining everyday life is not the same. So human rights is not about sameness. But the power of human rights is to question the taken for granted aspects of life, which we sort of wear as clothing without questioning why is it this color or that color. I think that's what human rights has given us, to be able to question. And do we do something about it after questioning? Well, there, again, collective action is the way to go, because as individuals, women have always questioned patriarchy and have always negotiated with patriarchy in their daily life. But sometimes the consequences for these women have been very, very severe as individuals. But through collective action, through transnational movements, I think we were able to make a lot of leeway that affected women's lives very positively in different corners of the world. But it's a non-ending story, no doubt, and it's a very dialectical process. So let's not take human rights as a sort of a wine that can change the world. It's not something like this. It's a reference point which allows us to question taken for granted aspects of life and to search for alternative ways of engaging at daily life and with our states, at the international. That's why it's so difficult, because you're trying to change the terms of engagement, whether your terms of engagement with your intimate partner or the terms of engagement with your state or international relations at large. That's why people are fighting. If it was just a matter of asking, you know, everybody recognizing that everybody is human, we all have rights, therefore it should be given, fine. But it's not that simple. It's recasting the whole situation. Architecture, I think, in that sense, is a powerful terminology. You're rebuilding, deconstructing the way things have come and reconstructing towards another modality. But that modality will become the status quo and will create its own opposition. So I sort of like to look at the world in within a dialectical lens. So it's not a non-ending story in a way. That's why I like the point that the video made, unfinished journey. It's not going to finish.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Go ahead.
Thank you so much for this evening, for the film and the panelists. Just a quick question. If the panelists could reflect on the ways in which a neoliberal, capitalist, or profit-led fundamentalism shapes women's human rights, the understanding of women's human rights and subjectivities, and undermines women's human rights, and the attendant idea that a democratization of economic space and thinking can actually amplify women's human rights. So sort of the intersection between patriarchy, racism, colonialism, militarism, and neoliberal economic thinking. Thanks.
Yakin?
Oh my gosh.
Good luck with that.
Well, that's, I think that would take hours to discuss. But, you know, neoliberalism has brought about very contradictory forces that have affected women's lives. On the one hand, it has changed the market demand for labor, which opened up space for women's paid labor, cheap, flexible work hours, etc., offshore production, which at the same time destroyed local livelihoods, leaving young women to go and take up these very low-paid jobs. But at the same time, it gave women an opportunity to escape the patriarchy at home, but only to be caught up with patriarchy at different levels. So it's a very complex process, and it's not a simple, but I think what is important to note, though, without getting into all the discussions, is that it has created new contradictions, and I think that is important. New contradictions come with opportunities as well as risks. But that's the only way we can move forward, I think, to sort of go beyond the stagnation that perpetuates status quo. So it has both opportunities and risks involved. But one of the main constraints, however, is something that I have been interested in for a long time is the whole discourse of rights being very hierarchically structured, where civil and political rights having more prominence and economic rights being undermined. And we see this in all the economic programs that are being promoted, including the Millennium Goals, where women's rights are generally reduced to areas which don't seem to be relevant to issues of poverty, housing, livelihoods, etc., etc. So that's one of the challenges for feminists to sort of have a feminist political economy perspective to make the linkages of the different spheres of life and show that coercion comes in not only through brute physical force, but it comes through distributional structures, through unequal entitlements, etc., where women become target of abuse and face different risks. So those, I think I would approach that question within that kind of a framework. I don't know if that answers your question, though.
Manas, do you want to make any closing remarks? Go ahead, closing remarks.
Thank you so much. If you could just give me a couple of minutes, I really want to thank Terry Gordman, the director of the Gender Studies program and an associate professor of comparative literature at the New School, where we are permanent guests, actually. Jonathan Bach, the chair of global studies at the New School for Public Engagement, and also Pamela Tillis, the director of public programs at the New School for Public Engagements. This has been an annual event, and thank you all for supporting us, for hosting us. Thank you so much for my three friends, our panelists, for CordAid and SIDA, our supporters, our donors. all my colleagues at WLP, particularly Alison, who has helped so much, and also I can personally testify to the last 2-3 weeks of making this film and how much Mahnaz has put in terms of stress. And so thank you so much, Mahnaz. And a big, big, big thank you to our friends, our filmmakers, Deborah Bergeron of Rain Lake, for this yet another wonderful documentary. Can I promise people we'll have another documentary next year? So we will have another documentary next year. Thank you all ever so much. This is an unfinished conversation, so we'll probably get back to it next year.
Yes, so please join us in the lobby to continue the conversation and join the reception.